From time to time, we are reminded of the importance of Operation Security, or OPSEC for short. And while the term is heavily buried within the content and jargon of the military, it very regularly translates itself back to the individual citizen, as we continue to see, at least within gun culture and to some extent America as a whole, the desire for decentralization to take place. We want to be able to move away from being centrally dependent or dependent on a central organization for some reasons because we recognize that it's not stable, and for other reasons like, say, tyranny or malfeasance. And so the word OPSEC itself can be muddied, bloodied, and expanded well beyond its reach, so much so that it becomes difficult to define itself. It's a broad topic when we talk about it, and it gets even broader when we talk about its application, but we must start somewhere. And in order to start here, what we're going to do is we're going to play into the trope of conventional warfare in the form of a board game. When I was a child in the 90s and into the early 2000s, occasionally we'd sit down and play board games long before the internet. Well, not long, but whatever, right? And one board game that we'd play from time to time was one called STRATEGO. And I don't know if anyone's going to challenge my pronunciation, but there's my Midwestern accent for you. And Stratego is a board game loosely themed off of the Napoleonic Wars, where players seek to hide their flags, their capital of sorts, their key pieces in a sea of similarly looking pieces, so that the opponent cannot easily identify their critical points of leadership. In other words, or and how the game, or yeah, in other words, how the game played. What the goal of the game was to for each player. It was a two-player game. The goal of each player was to identify the location of the enemy's flag and attack it appropriately. The challenge of it, though, is that only the player. So you had lines of pieces in kind of a grid, and each player was able to see where their pieces were, or what all of the identities of those pieces were, while the opposing force, the other player, did not know. He had to try to figure it out, and there was this sort of testing process. But in its most simplest format, what we would see as a breach of OPSEC, or Operation Security in the board game of Stratego, would be if a one player's piece was somehow capable of accessing Twitter and social media and casually posting about their environment and the people they are surrounded by. But this topic is also reached elements of gun culture, even in different sub communities and subgroups, where you'll see the words or the letters IYKYK, referring to if you know, you know. And this is a subtle nod between people who are on the inside of a joke or an idea. To those who are outside of it, who do not know the things that if you know, you know, for them, they are perhaps left with the mystery of what's going on. But if we're going to talk about the importance of Operation Security, on its nose, it seems kind of obvious. You wouldn't want to advertise to your enemies in a conventional war where your key pieces were, would you? If you could obscure your supply lines, your logistics core, your leadership, your organization structure, if you could hide your strike teams in such a way that the enemy didn't know where you'd attack, when you'd attack, or with what force you would attack, then you had an advantage over them. Of course, this game of strategy that we like to portray conventional war, especially the Napoleonic era of maneuver war, heavily depended on being able to gain some sort of upper ground, physically or metaphorically, over your opponent to counter and crush their forces in a way that they couldn't riposte, they couldn't respond, they had to flee, or they were completely captured. Napoleon famously gained some of his military regard because he was playing the game that all the other balance of power generals were playing, but he was playing to win on a level deeper than what they were willing to commit to. Napoleon's goal was to completely and utterly destroy, crush, and cripple his opposing forces, as opposed to beat them in a gentlemanly game. And So as that was his goal and his strategy, part of his strategy, it meant the stakes were higher. And so, of course, he would need to be very careful at obscuring his communication. So the most classic example of a breach of operation security would be to, if you communicated via courier, have one of those couriers be turned by the enemy. We once again think back in the time of spies and the court, even the court as depicted in Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, where he talks about Balthazar Gracian's commands or suggestions to his pupil, Machiavelli, to always maintain an air of mystery. If you are predictable, you are predictably beaten. If you are reliable, but reliability and predictability being different, then people could trust you. But predictable meant that you could be manipulated. And then, of course, mavericks in their foolishness will try to apply this into some sort of insane strategy and cost many, many lives. The issue with the issue with, when we talk about this idea of the Machiavellian fantasy world, is that it is not a one-to-one reflection of our own. There are kernels of truth planted in these ideas. How much do you say? How do you control your speech? How do you present yourself? What does your reputation look like? But the issue when we use the word Machiavellian is that it is fundamentally an ends justify the means worldview. And in the short term, that might produce for us some element of success, but in the long term, it leads to destruction. Even if that destruction takes place so late in life that we don't get to witness it as publicly. Imagine a man who has spent his life playing the most Machiavellian strategies against his opponents, whether it is in the corporate world, whether it's in his own businesses, or it's in government, only to, in his wasting years, be driven into a great and incompetent tragedy where he has to witness time after time the corruption and degradation of his soul. And what is sacrificed on the altar of his Machiavellianism is the very thing he might be setting out to save. A tragedy would be such that a person makes sacrifices of his own moral foundation such that he could provide a better life for his children, only to find out that those moral sacrifices that he participated in also led to secondary and tertiary effects on his children, ultimately spoiling any sort of value he had to pass on. Now, when I was a child, my grandfather used to tell these stories. He was a veteran of World War II and of the Korean War, during which, in the Korean War, he was a prisoner of war for 3 years after about a year-long campaign in the country. And my grandfather himself was not so much of an articulate academic, but he was what you would refer to as genuinely American in his ingenuity and his skills. He was an excellent shot. But my grandfather witnessed multiple times, and as I grew older, and as I grew, correction, pause. As I grew older, and as I joined the military and continued to have conversations with him, he was a rather isolated individual. He kept to himself quite a bit in his own environment, but as he had something to talk about with me, because we were both military people, or we both had military experience, I began to listen a little bit more intently to the stories that I heard, or the versions of the stories that I heard when I was a child. And one story that continues to stick out is that for a while, their unit that they were deployed, I guess if they still would refer to it as deployments back then, the unit that they had a crisis of leadership. One of their leaders, whether it was a platoon sergeant or a PL, was continuously making decisions that were in part out of cowardice and in part out of selfishness that were leading to problems when they would face combat. Some of the examples, the less egregious examples, is he would force men to build foxholes in convenient locations and then evict them from their hard work as the evening was descending, so that the man himself could take their foxhole. He would say, Private Johnson, go dig this foxhole here. And so Johnson would go to work digging the foxhole, making it as best as he possibly could. And then this leader would come by and say, you know what, I think you should be over there. And then conveniently be found later sleeping in said foxhole, neglecting his own team, his own company, his own platoon, whatever it was. And the other side, and he continued to do this. He continued to do things similar to this, where not only was he forcing his own men to suffer more, and unapologetically so, but he was stealing food and leaving people open to ambush and causing problems. And so at one time when they were attacked by a Chinese surge, or a Chinese, it wasn't really an ambush. I think my grandfather described it as Chinese. I could be wrong, but as they were being attacked by an enemy force, an American ran over to this officer and shot him in the back of the head, which is a story that we find difficult to stomach, right? It's like an American killing another American in war. Aren't we supposed to have loyalty and camaraderie and brotherhood? But what it goes to show is that, and the reason why I tell this story is that when you have some weaknesses that you face, some challenges that you face when you're in a conflict, that have life and death consequences, are not purely driven by the kind of malice we see in mustache twisting bad guys. Sometimes the issues that you face when you're dealing with an organization as large as the military is that, as the old adage goes, loose lips sink ships. That you have that you have opposing forces trying to gather information on what you are planning to do, what your military is capable of, where your factories are, and because somebody has a big mouth, they're able to extract information from that person, maybe even without them knowing. OPSEC is a difficult game because it's hard to measure how effective it is. Operation security is such that you only know it's working when your enemy doesn't know what you're doing, but it's almost impossible to know if they know what you're up to until it's too late. And there is no easy way around it. There's no way to escape this information game that we play. We hear it stated, we hear the world that we live in today as something like fifth generational warfare or the fifth generation of warfare. And while this theory, this sort of war theory, appeals to both a military and civilian audience, or a veteran and cultured audience, it can become a little misleading. Information warfare is, in its worst description, a war using all means necessary, including deception and upheaval of your enemy's population. Insurgency isn't even the extreme end. Rather, conspiracies and psyops and all of these infinite number of government trickeries are used on populations to turn them into useful idiots in order to accomplish some nefarious goal. Or at least that's how fifth generation warfare is so often described. But in one of the tools that we would actually address, and more appropriately address, is that while OPSEC, or Operation Security, has always been an important component of military application, as the stakes get higher with each potential attack, going from bows and arrows to ambushes to rockets to nuclear bombs, the issue of Operation Security is that the more devastating or destructive an action can be, the more important it is to keep it locked behind closed doors and amongst confidence only. But then again, doesn't that look like conspiracy? Isn't that any action where a person is trying to keep some information guarded, isn't that signal itself for, well, a conspiracy? And we hear words like the quiet professional, and we hear words where special operations individuals are expected to function in a level of anonymity. Imagine, if you could, how many times, or actually not even imagine, how many times have we watched a movie where the MacGuffin-ish element of the movie, the thing that carries the plot forward, is that there is a list of all known operatives, spies, in a current operating environment that is being transported to the enemy stronghold by a rogue agent. So, operation security can apply in this scenario. It can apply to how do we protect our own information from spies themselves, which we accomplish through things like vetting or compartmentalizing information, not allowing the entire plan to be in the hands of any one individual, except for those at the very, very, very top with a very, very small circle, which does produce a bit of exclusivity if you think about it. And the issue that you run in and how that plays out and how that looks like in a classic special operations or military environment is that people are given a compartment of information that pertains to their actions that they will be engaging with, so that if captured or if they are, let's say, a little, again, loose with their lips, they will not sink the entire ship in one go. Because, as we have seen, and is not so unfamiliar of a concept, a lonely private with a big mouth is is easy prey for a uh, seductive spy willing to jump their bones for a little information. Insert your classic Americanized version of the Russian spy woman in the red dress or whatever it is today, and you'll get a classic problem. If your people don't have integrity, or there where when your soldiers and your participants in your community struggles with various parts of integrity whose side effect turns into potential breaches of security, you have an issue. Imagine you have amongst you you've assembled your Avengers, your team, your core group of men, but one of them has the tendency to not only run his mouth, but for the intent to run his mouth because he is trying to get attention of the fair sex. What happens when although in all other environments he's a trustworthy guy, he's on time, he's physically usually above everybody else, or whatever it is you can say, but unfortunately for the team, he can't really keep his act together in certain types of public environments. You could say, well, you could deny this person the opportunity to spend time in that environment, but that's just not realistic. People desire relationships. And so Operation Security, OPSEC, as we've been talking about, is a thorough game. But the most important, and I'm sorry, and if you want to read up on how let's just read the subtitle of this one. This is called The Code Book by Simon. I'm guessing that's Sign, because I'm not going to be able to read it properly. But I was reading this book earlier this year as recommended by Peter Johnson of Archway Defense, who was our first co-conspirator with season 1, Operation 1, Cabin in the Woods. And the book tells sort of a history of code writing. Baked into that is a history of Operation Security. It turns out is as old as communication. Now, we've talked quite a bit about not only what Operation Security is, but why it's important. And to punch well above my belt line, what you find out is that even the President of the United States and his press corps is not immune from this problem. Now, traditionally, and when we think about OPSEC as a whole, we traditionally, and for good reason, naturally go back to thinking about a military style operation, some sort of spies, secret operatives, the protection of personal information, maybe hiding your bank account number, putting your not writing the password to your computer on a sticky note and sticking that to the bottom of the desk. But we also run into a much greater problem. As I said earlier, the tricky part about OPSEC is it's difficult to determine whether if it's working, because one thing that we don't know, or we often don't know, is how much information has been gathered on us by a malicious enemy. Social media or the app that you're watching this on or listening to this might be gathering data on you, which is going to draw not only ire, but concern. What do I do? How much information is being gathered on me? What is that what is being done? Where is it being sold to? How is it being communicated? Where is that spread going? How far can I see it? There are various tools that we can use to limit that. But unfortunately, for those of us who grew up in the internet age, or were coming into our teenage and maybe emotionally volatile years when social media was just expanding and we hadn't quite seen the limits of it, we overshared a little too much 20, 30, 40 years ago, and we don't have the billions of dollars necessary to scrub the internet of our information. In fact, a personal story would be that I remember before joining the military, that social media such as Facebook was kind of the primary platform at the time. And people would share little things like what their status was, or what they ate for dinner, or where they're at and how they're doing things. And over time, that program that the algorithms and what encouraged people's movements and how our trends changed led to more and more and more and more sharing. You weren't just posting senior book photos and cute pictures of your dog. People were walking through their homes, their neighborhoods, even giving definitive tours of their daily habits. Something when you look at reconnaissance, not patrolling as it's oftentimes mistaken in the gun culture. No, your 16-inch AR-15 with your binos does not simply mean that you're doing reconnaissance. You might be doing long range patrolling. And we'll get, that's always a fun can of worms to dig into. But one thing that when you're trying to gather information on a person that you go through is establishing a pattern of life. Where do they live? Where do they work? What does their schedule look like? And if I can predictably or if I can predict where you're going to be, when you're going to be, and what you're going to be doing there, and how long you're going to be there, if I know your pattern of life well enough where I believe that I can predict your movements, then I have a great deal of power over you. If the app on your phone can tracks so much data on you that it can tell when you're going to the bathroom, or what products you're searching, or what needs that you have, then we have what looks like a meta problem, pun intended, of operation security violations. The phone in your pocket, as we've been warned, does tend to be a violation in itself. Sometimes overtly, whether it's somebody hacks into your phone and turns on the microphone and listens to you talk, or is something more covertly, like, well, I know that he's using, or like the tracking device, the GPS unit can be pinged to figure out your location without your knowing it. Or maybe it's something as simple as tracking your purchase patterns. Which gas station do you go to? Which grocery store do you go to? Which do you shop at? Let's see. Do you shop at Cub Foods, or do you shop at Kroger's? Is that how much information can be gathered you about your income? Or let's even look at what social media does. Where do you work? Where do you live? Do I have your address? Do I know what your phone number is? How many family members you have? Where do you live? Where do you go for your dog to be groomed at? Who's your vet? Who's your therapist? Who's your counselor? Who's your pastor? Who's your boss? What are your political leanings, and so forth? All of these items are things that we'd want to protect to some extent under the practice of operation security. And so let's get into our closing elements. What is OPSEC? We've talked about it earlier. We've this whole diatribe, this whole conversation about OPSEC and operation security has been various elements of displaying how it's abused, how it can be wielded, how it can be attacked. But let's break it down into a very simple conclusion. Operation security is the protection of information that is pertinent to either your actions as an individual or the actions of your organization as a whole. That is that kind of information that, if got out in the sense of an overt war, like let's just say in our case, if a commander of Unit A were to get onto social media and say, tomorrow we attack at dawn at this location with this many men and using this strategy, an opponent would be able to effectively produce a counter. Or if I were to say, I am releasing this product that I'm releasing this product and I'm doing it tomorrow, and I have not even, or I want to, and I've produced this idea out there and I've put it out into the void in that open source fashion, but then later felt the sting of somebody else with a faster manufacturing process getting it to market before me. What I've done is I have failed to ensure that my operation security practices align with my publishing timeline so that other people aren't able to capitalize on my hard work. Now, outside of the goon culture, as it has been criticized in the past, which has somehow turned Operation Security, or a loose caricature of Operation Security, hence the name Redacted, into an aesthetic, we can see how this plays out. Or not that's not the right way of saying it. We've seen this idea travel through history through different methods, whether it's in aesthetics, cultures, times, ideas, and strategies. But what Operation Security looks like in our day and age, on the one hand, varies depending on what you are doing professionally, and on the other hand, is consistent across populations. And we started by saying that OPSEC is such a broad topic when it comes to application that it can be difficult to nail down, but we must start somewhere. And we started with the overt format of conventional war as described in a Napoleonic fashion. I want to obscure the movements of my troops and my lines, and I want to make sure that orders sent from one commander to another, or from a leader to a subordinate, do not fall into enemy hands. And I want to limit, through all means necessary, or within a, let's just say, a moral framework, I want to limit the natural bleeding of secretive, because people love to tell secrets. Being in on a secret it feels like a sense of power. We want to limit that information getting out of our control. We want to know if the secret plans of the Death Star are acquired by the hands of rebels, so to speak. And so how we do that is we identify key pieces of information that we don't want communicated. In the war in Ukraine, we got to see this take place in real time, where Americans or Westerners would enter into this Eastern European battleground with the naivety of going out, taking their cell phone, taking a selfie, publishing that selfie on, or that picture on social media, triangulating their exact location, allowing foreign operatives who were not really determined about their social life for the kicks to target their pattern of life and take them out quite literally with ease. And so the first element of Operation Security is be aware of and careful about what information you broadcast. If you're concerned about your location being tracked by malicious attackers, do not publish that information in real time. Let me restate this. At the time that I got out of, by the time I got out of Ranger Battalion, the trend at the time was human trafficking. What do you call them? The human traffickers would use social media not only to groom individuals, but locate them, identify a pattern of life, and capture them, which would be, the ideal candidate, young women, young girls, who would foolishly, for the sake of likes and clicks, or because the algorithm promoted these kinds of activities, or whatever you want to be your boogeyman, they were able to use social media to accurately predict a pattern of life of a target. They were able to figure out when they went to work, where they traveled, where their home was, where they got their food, where they got their coffee, where they got their gas, all without the target knowing what was going on, and set up an opportunity for attack. This means the most basic element of Operation Security is be careful what you post in real time. If you're going to do a live feed, if you're going to do publicly post information on where you're at, you must accept the consequences of presenting that pattern of life to be available to the community. to anyone who you know or don't know is observing. You can't perfectly limit the information that enters the internet, but you can make steps to limit how much is available. You wouldn't publish your social security number on the internet, but you would consider but you might be willing to say every day where you got your coffee, where do you buy your books, where do you go to school, what is your class schedule like. These are things that, while they do offer opportunities for us to build community with one another and have like-minded experience and discover where old friends are, we have to be careful about where that information goes. As we step a little bit closer to home, we can take active measures to limit how much information is made available to the public. Social media is going to be easily the biggest factor. Be careful what you post, and if it can be used to build a pattern of life, watch out. A practice that you and your friends can willingly do with one another is ask each other to try to use social media to determine their pattern of life. You can go to your friends, you can go to your colleagues, you can go to your business partners and say, "Hey, I'm concerned that let's play a game. Let's try to use what information open source. This would be open source information, or not. It's not OPSEC, but OSINT, open source, OSINT, open source intelligence, to build a pattern of life on one another, because one of the critical concerns about operation security is most people look internally. They think about themselves. This is where the selfishness comes out in people, where they think, well, I have kept myself safe, not realizing that the friends and family of the people they're accidentally doxing will be left to the consequences of your foolishness. Yes, I understand my tone changed. And so, one of the things that people will make mistakes on is that they will reveal information about people who aren't themselves. And that information will get into the hands of nefarious actors. And those nefarious actors will use the information that you foolishly provided to the internet to attack the lives of people that you may not know about. Sure, you will not be held responsible before a court of law, most likely, but you will be held responsible before either God or your conscience. So be careful about the information that you put out into the internet. It cannot be brought back. That being the case, good pieces of equipment to have, try to good practices to have. Red team your own information, or have people you know and trust try to do it for you. The more that you explore this operation, the more that you see your own weaknesses. Don't commit crimes, but try to figure it out. What's your pattern of life? Where do you go to food? Where does this thing happen? What are your habits that that make you predictable? And be willing and open and honest to allow criticism in the door. Second, worth doing is, there's a couple of pieces of equipment that might be worth purchasing. One, VPNs are always a good idea. Notice we don't have a VPN sponsor. One of them, though, is consider a VPN. Another one is look into Faraday bags. Now, having a Faraday bag does not make you invincible, but it is one more tool in the toolbox, and they're not cost prohibitive. Let's say, I think the company that sells them is SLNT, also known as Silent. And a Faraday bag where you can put your computer and your phone in are a clear example of something that is better to have and not needed than needed and not have it. Third, if you're going to go do something where you are concerned that people might be tracking your location, leave your phone at home. This is not an admonition to go do crime, but it is a point that if you're going to be, let's say, straying in areas that might be under surveillance, don't bring your phone. I don't care if it's on your plate carrier or in your pocket. Don't bring it. And then fourth and final is talk to the people who are closest to you, your wives, your friends, your girlfriends, your children, and make sure that they're aware, without giving them some semblance of terror that everyone's out to get them, that operation security is important, not only now as we see the decentralization of warfare once again turn the world towards irregular forces, And the point in conveying it to them is that it's not to make their lives more paranoid, but it is something that gives them a practice that they start early. Simple things: don't post your current location. But when you're putting out information, be careful about not making it, or don't publicly state where you are and what you're doing. Do not publish information that makes it easy to establish a pattern of life. Today I got to work at this time, I ate my coffee at this place, I get my food and drink my piss and whatever. I know that sounded weird, but do not make it easy for somebody to build a pattern of life just by your social media. And from there, if you're a public figure, do not hire social media people who do not understand what operation security is. Doxing is the process of publishing a person's private information, and that is bad. If I were to find out where you lived, who your parents were, what their social security number was, and published all that information for the world to see, we would consider that doxing. And it's a nice tactic that's used by malicious actors, because person A over here doxes your information on a seemingly innocuous public location, and person over here, B, takes that information and plans and builds a pattern of life on you, and then sabotages or attacks your home. It's not like they're always connected. The decentralization of warfare, or the functions of insurgency, have gone so well to explain compartmentalizations of attack. If I can build a strike team that gathers information and operates independently, like the Rangers in the early American frontier, or if I can build a terror cell, this is all metaphorical, that is able to function somewhat independently, all I need to do is feed that group or that actor the right information that drives him in the direction of the attack. And the person feeding the information might not be wittingly doing so. It might be some foolish kid with a cell phone, or the presidential media team with a camera. So, if this is not a subtle enough reference to what we're talking about, please recognize, or please join us in the conversation. Please join the Redacted Culture Cast as we continue to talk about violence, culture, philosophy, strategy, and ethics. And we will continue going forward. If you want to support the channel and you want to join the craziest chat ever, well, we're going to have some fun with it. You can head over to redactedculture.locals.com and support us there. If you just want to jump on our merch train and make yourself look, what is it? Is it cringe? Do we still use the word cringy? Or did Matt Mason ruin that with his hit single? Doesn't matter. If you want to jump on and support us in another way, we still have a limited number of patches available that have IR identifiers built into them, or a couple of other things, and you can find those at redactedllc.com. You can also do just redactedllc.com/merch, because that's how we keep this show going, giving you the intellectual tools to go forward into the 21st century, not only physically equipped and mentally able, but intellectually equipped and physically skilled. That being the case, thank you much for listening. Now go forth and conquer.